The topic of this session would be how Pakistan became an Asian tiger by 2050. In the panel we have Dr. Nadeem ul Haq, who is the former Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission of Pakistan, Dr. Ali Cheema from LUMS, Mr. Savail M. Hussain from Sayyid Engineers, and Mr. Ejaz Haider, who would be our moderator. Over to Mr. Haider. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this thing working? Yeah, okay. Right, from Persian to English. Our anthem is all in Persian. We're talking about this book, looking back how Pakistan became an Asian tiger by 2050. This is an alternate story of Pakistan. And it's been penned by Dr. Nadeem ul Haq, and we're going to discuss this in terms of why he has presented an alternative story of Pakistan and whether this alternative is still feasible, whether we can actually be there in 2050. One of the things that Dr. Haq has been talking about for a very long time is reform. And in terms of reform, whether there is the kind of conversation happening in this country which can lead to reform. Now, we all know, we are living in this era of the social media. There's a lot of cacophony, a lot of noise, but it's more about conversation and less about conversation. So the focus on conversation is something that we'll begin with, and I will request Dr. Haq to give us a synopsis of what he means by that conversation and what he means by reform, and then we'll take it up further. Dr. Sir.
Thank you, Ejaz. मेरा ख्याल दरवाज़ा बंद कर दे, पीछे काफ़ी शोर है. अच्छा जी, I hope everybody can hear me. Writing a book is fun, but selling it is very difficult. And you have to do events like this, and you have to convince people to read it. Unfortunately, when you do it in Pakistan, it's even worse. Because in Pakistan, nobody reads. And I've also found nobody buys books. Everybody says to me, यार, तू मुझे मुफ्त दे, मैं क्यों खरीदूं? और किताब की कीमत पता है कितनी है? 300 रुपए. तो कई दफ़ा वो खाना खिला रहे होते हैं मुझे जिसकी कीमत होती है 10-15 हज़ार रुपए, given various things inside included. वो 300 रुपए की किताब नहीं लेंगे. बट दूसरी चीज़ है कि वो किताब अगर उनको दे भी दो तो पढ़ेंगे नहीं. बहुत सारे लोग ले लेते हैं, किताब पढ़ते नहीं हैं. Unfortunately, I think very few people read. There are many people here who comment on that, PT and various people. So that's a first thing about the book. Okay, writing it is difficult, and writing is not that difficult. Selling it is very difficult, and getting a debate on it is even more difficult because people don't want to debate and review. We have these conferences, but I go to these conferences all the time, and I don't hear anybody citing any thesis or any hypotheses. Secondly, we are so invested in history. We want to know everything about Muhammad bin Qasim, Tipu Sultan, and the minister of this, and whatever, and we want to know about the architecture. Economy doesn't concern us. Economy is always the last event in such conferences. Some of these conferences don't even have the economy there. So quite frankly, are we interested in economics or not? So that's my first point where I begin off. Now, I don't know whether I can present the book to you or not, and I don't even intend to. I'm just going to give you 3 basic points that I make in the book and leave it to you to read, hopefully, and discuss it. The book is meant to be provocative, and the book is meant to challenge you and push you. Very briefly, I'm an economist. I've written many books and papers, but they're very boring. Only 5 people read them in the world. Nobody else can read them, right? So I thought this time, if I write a book, it should be something that people can read and not just my friends, the economists. So I didn't want to hide behind my mathematics and statistics, which I normally do. Let me put it to you very frankly, I normally hide behind those things. And believe me, let me tell you quite frankly, all economists, when they use data and figures and charts, they're hiding behind those things. And I say that advisedly. This is what Hayek said, this is what Friedman said, this is what so many others are saying. We are hiding behind. And Milton Friedman, the famous economist, taught me, if you can't explain it to the ordinary person, obviously you haven't understood the subject. All you're trying to do is show off with your math. So I hope I'm not going to do that. Second thing for writing this book this way was, we are dismal people. Every time I say anything about economic, people say, oh my God, you're calling a crisis, you're doing this, you're that. Obviously, you are doomsaying and you think Pakistan is bad, be positive, etc. So I thought, I don't want to be that anymore. So ladies and gentlemen, this is a positive book. We are making Pakistan an Asian tiger in 2050. I have used fiction, I've used poetic license, I've gone forward and I've said Pakistan has become an Asian tiger. Now I look back and I see how has Pakistan become an Asian tiger. So what do? I have 3 points to make, as I said. The first point is, we are still sitting with Keynes's defunct economists. The economic dialogue in this country is very bad, is passé, has not developed from Mahbub ul Haq, still stuck in the 1960s. We still think, and the policymakers still think, that policy is getting more taxes. Donors advise them get more taxes. I read every day newspapers and various economic seminars, get more taxes, get more taxes. Today, for example, Asad Umar put out a tweet, hey, look, we've got more taxes in KP. Look at Punjab, we are going to get more taxes. Dar also did the same thing. You look at the newspapers, every morning these famous journalists, whatever journalists there are, they are going to give you budgetary figures all the time. The second thing we love doing is projects, mega projects, the bus project, this project, that project. The third thing we love doing is looking for aid. I would say very simple, we are a beggar nation. We go around begging for aid everywhere. I don't know why, but we do that. And we think that begging for aid is the most important thing in the world, right? So we keep begging for aid. So we've got 3 things in our folder, economics folder. Beg for aid, get more taxes, do more projects. Somewhere along the line, we pay homage to social sectors. So we'll do the Punjab Economic Foundation, BISP, etc., etc. But those are again donor projects. It's not as if we've thought them up. Those are donor projects. So that's what we do. Even the Supreme Court Chief Justice said the other day that we don't have, we don't have any, our legal system is sitting in the 19th century. Even the Supreme Court Chief Justice said exactly that. So that's where we are sitting right now. So the first point that I want to make is we've got a tunnel view. The famous thing that somebody said about, I'll say this about Pakistan, that a Pakistani was looking for policy ideas, solutions, etc., thought he's searching under a light. Somebody comes and asks him, hey, why are you searching here? Searching for his keys. He said, I'm looking under the light because I lost my keys 2 miles away, but the light is here. So I'll look here, I won't look where I lost my keys. It's the same thing with Pakistan. We are looking for solutions in foreign policy, in data, in various things, but not looking for the real solution. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I'd say is, while we are sitting in the economics of the past, economics has moved on. 2008, there was a major crisis. I hope all of you know there was a crisis. Sometimes in Pakistan classes, I find people don't know that there was a global crisis in 2008. 2008 crisis forced us to change the way we think. Economics, my friends, has undergone a huge change, and it's time that we brought it to our classrooms here. Unfortunately, our classrooms are still teaching the old economics, not the new economics, and we should do that. I know Cheema is working on that in his class. He's got some collaboration with some university in England, but I think we need to mainstream that, the changes in economics. The departure point that I take is a new subject called complexity, which is evolutionary, takes off as an evolutionary system. It's the economics version of evolutionary biology, which says, hey, don't look for equilibriums, don't look for standard solutions, try and look for systemic solutions and try and look for evolutionary solutions. When you start thinking like that, it's a wholly different approach. It's no longer what I used to do in the past. Hey, run one regression, follow the data. So we follow the fiscal data because fiscal data is available. We don't worry about the rest. We follow the schooling data because schooling data is available. But we don't know where the wealth of society is. We don't know where society is moving. We don't know where political economy is. So we are following the data. We are putting up MDGs because the UN told us to do MDGs or the SDGs. We are harping on themes that the US or the UN told us. We don't have any endogenous analysis. You say build more infrastructure. Why? Because Mahbub ul Haq told us to build more infrastructure. Mahbub ul Haq is the most effective economist I know. The rest of us have failed. We don't work, right? So that's the key thing. So what happens is we keep repeating history. If you read the standard textbooks or whatever, books in economics, they'll start off with Ayub and they'll do Bhutto and then they keep moving forward. They'll have empty statements like elite capture. They'll say, follow the best practice. We know how the world did this. We can just follow it. We don't have to do anything. Implementation, implementation, implementation. CPEC is a game changer. You've heard all these things. They're all useless. They won't work because they don't sit well with the analysis of Pakistan. CPEC is a game changer now. Kerry Lugar was a game changer 5 years ago. So what happened? Kerry Lugar's come and gone, and CPEC will come and go too. We'll be sitting like this and talking about it. So what is it? The third point says, guys, start thinking with the new economics, start thinking complexity, start thinking new growth economics, etc., etc. Development is not something that we can force. Development is not something that I can do through my plans and policies. Development is not something that I can present to you on a table. Development happens when you understand the evolution of the system and when you begin to understand how that system is moving and how it can be fixed to make it more development oriented. How do we fix the system? It forces us to think of policies very differently. Policies no longer do this, do that. Very often people say, hey, educate everybody, do that. That's crap, it doesn't work. It sounds very nice in political statements, never works. Nadi has written a lovely paper on why Pakistani education system is so flawed. We keep talking about spending more. I've always said, let's kill the education department. We don't need any education because unfortunately the bureaucracy won't let it happen, right? Government, we use this term we. Who's this we? I don't even know who the we is. There's no we in economics. The government is not mine, it's yours or anybody. Government has a mind of its own and its functionaries have an incentive system of their own. We have to think about it. So what I end up doing is analyzing the whole thing from an incentive point of view, and I say reform. Now reform, Ejaz is mentioned. We use the reform as an empty word. For example, when they put a tax on, we call it a reform. My agency does it, IMF does this all the time. Hey, we put on new taxes, that's a reform. We change the exchange rate, that's a reform. No, that's not a reform. Reform is when you change the system. Reform is when you change the balance sheet. Reform is when you change the way you use assets. That's very important to think about. Reform is not a dollar matrix of do this, do that, and capacity build and build NGOs. It doesn't work. Unless we change systems, unless we change the way we do things, unless you change incentive, personnel, so many things that have to happen. Reform is a change in the way business is done, and we have to think about it. If we do this reform has to be, first of all, locally developed, understood, owned. It can't be brought in from an outside. You can't hire McKinsey's to do your report as we do. We hire McKinsey's to do a report, we hire some donor to do a report, and we think we made reform. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. There are tons of reports lying there. I think Parvez Tahir is here, former chief economist, tell you how many reports are lying there. Sorry, it won't work. We have to work out our own reform, and that's a very difficult thing to do. Now, another point that I make, which is very important. Reform doesn't require money. Reform brings money. Reform unlocks the wealth in society. If reform does not unlock the wealth in society, just take this for example. You've heard of General Motors failing. You've heard of many agencies, corporations in the West failing. They undergo restructuring and reform. What do? Through restructuring and reform, they find value and they come back to life. This is what reform has to happen in this country. And I can tell you, I can point out, if we do reform, there is at least, 5 or 6, maybe 10 times the GDP hidden in this country that we can unlock. The oil wealth of this country is reform. It's not minerals. How do we make that reform come out? That's a key point that I talk about in the book, and you must read it to understand it. But then, in order to understand reform, you must understand how a society is operating right now. And that's another dimension that I go into. Last word, please. We must rethink the way we think of economics. We've had too much of this, that, hey, the fiscal deficit 5.6% of GDP, investment is 10% of GDP, growth is 6% of GDP, and we've got the elasticity of substitution and this, that. This is all hiding behind numbers. It doesn't mean a damn thing. One regression doesn't tell you an economy. I've run them all my life. No model can tell you about the economy. This is what Hayek called scientism and hiding behind jargon. We have to be very clear about what we want, and we have to do our own analysis. I'm not saying don't do any of the rest. Yes, we have to do that too, but we have to do a bit of both, just like it happens all over the world. And this book is more about new kind of analysis presented to you in a user-friendly way. I wanted to write the book for the layman, for the student. It's up to you. Tell me if I succeeded. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Aliji, there are two levels there. One is, of course, discussing the book. This is the alternative that Dr. Haq has presented. It's partly fictionalized. So, to that extent, it can be discussed without any particular reference to the ground reality. But at the same time, because it provokes us into doing certain things, at some point we have to juxtapose this with what the reality of the ground is, and then see what the discrepancy is.
Sorry, Ejaz, I don't like the phrase ground reality. This is too bureaucratic. And
let's
ground reality, the bureaucrat always says they know ground reality better than us. And I promise you
Okay,
that,
let me-
I promise you
let
they
me-
don't. Anyway, he can take over.
Okay, let's forget ground. Let's stick with reality. Let's stick with what can be done and what cannot be done.
So let me start with a disclosure. I'm amongst the 5 economist friends of Nadeem who's read all his boring papers and liked some of them. But I also had the pleasure to read this book. I think that the book is very much grounded in reality. And I, like Nadeem, don't want to give the punchlines or many punchlines of the book, because it's a book you should definitely read. It's very accessible, it's easy to read, and it has big messages. But let me kind of contextualize it in some big concerns that we should be worried about in Pakistan and relate it back to what Nadeem was saying. So Pakistan was an economy that was a growth leader in South Asia. South Asia is the region that we belong to. And the nice thing about South Asia is if you go pre-47, we were one country, right? And then partition happened and you have different trajectories that different countries and economies were in. Something changed around the late 80s and early 90s. And since then, we have become a systematic laggard with regard to our competitors in virtually any indicator that you can pick. Now, why was this the case? Was Pakistan shunned by the globe? No, it wasn't. It was a lead ally in the economic and global alliances and security alliances. Was this an economy that did not liberalize and continue to follow old status paradigms? No, it's not. It was a leader in terms of opening up and virtually taking every prescription that came out of any think tank or bilateral or multilateral arrangement. Was it an economy that was starved for funds? No, we had shocks in this economy, and we can all remember them when we got surplus funds in. None of these things, whether it was the change in thinking, whether it was the availability or shocks of funds, whether it was access to global arrangements, in fact, changed the trajectory Pakistan has been on. And I think that this book is welcome because in some sense what it's doing, it's saying the underlying way in which we thought about the economy, which was in terms of simple accounting identities, कि budget deficit बढ़ा दोगे, investment बढ़ जाएगी, economy बढ़नी शुरू हो जाएगी. अगर वो नहीं करना तो trade deficit को manage कर लो. अभी भी जो सारी बहस चल रही है वो ये है कि import tariff बढ़ा दो तो suddenly price जो होगी, imports कम हो जाएंगी, foreign exchange crisis. What Nadeem's book is doing is whether, and I have agreements with the book in terms of not, but the value of the book to me is it's forcing you to think that you have to think deeper. And in some sense, I like what Nadeem has done and the way he set up this talk. Why do we need to do deeper? Because economics has started thinking in a much more deep way. And very frankly, economics has been thinking in a deeper way for a long time. What do economists think about? Economists think about incentives. They think about selection. They think about the ability to unleash accumulation, right? None of this is driven by somebody pressing a button. It's driven by things happening in the economy which create people to sort of take initiative, which squares things and unleashes growth. So once you start thinking about the economic paradigm in that sense, then the question becomes very different. And the question is that Pakistanis have the same needs as people have in other societies. They have the same value that they want to consume. But why is it that responses to those needs and demands are not happening? What is, and there's a famous economic historian called David Landis who wrote a brilliant book which was called Prometheus Unbound. Prometheus was this Greek figure who was supposed to take fire and save humanity. Pakistan's story is about Prometheus bound. So the question is, how do you unbind Prometheus? And that sort of, to me, is what is really important in terms of the way that we're thinking about it. We can move on the conversation. We can come back to this whole notion of how Nadeem thinks about doing this in terms of evolutionary theory and complexity. But that's kind of my initial opening pitch.
Savail, go on, give us your impressions.
First of all, I think it's a must-read book. It's very, very accessible, and it's about big picture messages. So the three fundamental things which kind of come out from a kind of a policy perspective, I would say. The first is that we need to start thinking, as Nadeem will mention in more detail, more about the software side of things as opposed to the hardware side of things. So the general approach has been, which the book documents, that we have been focused more on hardware, that we build roads or we do specific projects here and there, as opposed to looking at the software part, which is about aligning incentives in such a way that productive activity is unleashed, both from within the bureaucracy or within the governing elite, as well as the private sector. So I think that's a very, very important point to kind of, I think, discuss more and unpack. The second and related point to this is that once we start talking about the software side of things, of governance especially, then we have to talk about the bureaucracy and how the bureaucracy operates or has historically tended to operate. And when we talk about reform, and this is what Nadeem will, I think, go into more detail later, is both the staffing of that bureaucracy and the incentive structures that it faces. So if the bureaucracy is incentivized to do capture or do rent seeking, then obviously the economic outcomes for society won't be optimal from a growth perspective. So I think that's a very, very, when we talk about reform, and I think this is very, very important, that there can be no governance without bureaucratic reform. We talk about, how, there can be different parties, different leaders, how we should have elections and so forth. But underlying all of this, underlying the political process, governance is exercised through the bureaucracy at some level. And if that arm of the state is not equipped to handle the challenges of the present from a growth perspective, then I think that states will struggle to go forward. The second part, the second kind of policy pillar or message, I think, of this book is the importance of local government and how local government is tied in with cities and how cities are the engines of growth. Now, Pakistan, as this book also shows, makes clear, has been urbanizing very rapidly, although we still consider ourselves and we call ourselves an agricultural economy, whereas studies suggest that like 75% of our population is now urban or semi-urban. So one of the important points which this book makes is that if we start looking at cities as engines of growth, and this includes not just industry but also commerce, I think that is where a lot of the growth secret lies. But how do you unleash cities? Or how do you, we have always, when we think about cities and we think about urban planning and development, it's always about sprawl. Phase 6 bana do, phase 7 bana do, phase 8 bana do, defense ka. Whereas the concept of cities in the developed or now the developing world is about concentration, it's about density, it's about scaling up. Whereas we have always talked about scaling horizontally, making cities bigger, making more roads, to connect those, distances. So, but then here, the local government, the power of local government is very, very important. How do you structure that so that you can actually, start, eliciting demand from the grounds up? And that's how then, you can actually look at projects and projects can emerge. The third, I think the policy pillar or message of the book, which I was able to glean, is that I think that the focus has been a lot about how policy prescriptions are imported. Just as we import a lot of our goods, we also try and import thought. And there's nothing wrong with importing thought and ideas at a conceptual level. But I think that doing so has, what we've done is, I think, moved away from actually looking to generate ideas from within and debate them from within and build organizational or institutional structures which can harness and channelize, local experience as well as local prescriptions in light of local problems, as opposed to importing just big ideas and implementing them across the board. I can then,
Okay, so we're talking about reforms. So the question is this top down? Okay. If we are talking about conversation, at what level is the conversation happening? You keep talking about the bureaucracy. It just so happens that I was laid low by this virus in the last 5 days, and I was just watching Yes Minister. And every time I saw Sir Humphrey Appleby, I was reminded of you. And the fact that until you reform the bureaucracy, nothing is going to work. But I have been following your career, and for all your good intentions, you have actually pulled yourself to the periphery while emphasizing conversation. You haven't really had the conversation either with the bureaucracy or with your own peers. So what kind of conversation are we talking about, and at what level? Also, when you say that in Pakistan we don't have any conversation or analyses of the economy, if I look at how this works out in other countries as being a specialized field, you'll always have more people writing about politics and national security and the rest of it, and much fewer people writing about the economy.
Look, if you'd read the book, you would know what I'm saying. The book makes this case, and I think it's a fictional book, that's why I do it, but I think you'll think about it from history, for example. Change has always been bottom up. Change has never been top down, right? Yes, colonialism was top down, so it was kind of a change, yeah, so I take that back. But mostly, change is led by ideas. If you think back, for example, what was the Renaissance? Renaissance was ideas, right? Enlightenment, it was ideas. How did those ideas come into being? They came into being by 2 or 3, or communism was ideas. They came through violently. For example, the French Revolution or the Chinese Revolution, right? Or they came through reform, which was the English method of doing things, or the German, German was violent, went through the 2 world wars, right? So there are 2 ways of making change. Either you do it through reform, like the Civil War movement in the US or whatever. You have reform where you in a deep-seated change. Reform is not tinkering, it's deep-seated change in the way you do things in society, right? As I said, IBM went through restructuring and GM went through restructuring. They gave up parts of, IBM gave up the PC. We are not making the PC anymore. We are not doing this anymore, right? They actually made big decisions, and that is reform, right? So, but that can only happen when people accept reform. There are 2 things that are very important. Both the media where you sit and where the politician sits. Fawad Chaudhry. You are not leaders, you are followers. This is the big change that we have to make. A politician is never he never leads. He's always looking for votes. He's begging people for votes. He's pitching to the median voter. He's following the crowd. He is never going to lead. Same for you. You are bound by your ratings. You will never lead. You have to play to your ratings, right? It's the academics or the people outside the system, like Marx or whatever, who will bring about thoughts which will not work today. Communist Manifesto, PT is a big reader of that thing. He'll tell you Communist Manifesto was written in 1848. Revolution happened in 1917. So it's not as if it'll happen tomorrow. But ideas matter. In Pakistan, what's the tragedy is, yes, ideas matter in Pakistan too. The mullah is leading us. Whether we like it or not, he's leading us. He's got the ideas. We are kind of dragging back because we don't have the ideas. The donors come at us with ideas and we follow the donors. And this is part of the thing that I say in the book. The hope that I raise in the book is just like in the West. Like, for example, take the Maggie Thatcher or Reagan revolution, right? That revolution, the seeds of it lie in the debates of Hayek and Keynes or in the debate between Friedman and Samuelson. Those debates percolated for about 30, 40 years, and then those guys implemented it. Today, Trump is in a sense following that same debate, right? The Democrats are struggling because they've not been able to find a vision that they can sell. And when I say that there's no debate here, what I mean is we have no thickness in the economics profession. About 20 years ago, I wrote a paper on the economics profession in Pakistan, the history of the economics profession of Pakistan. My point is exactly there, and I maintain that point even today. How would I judge a debate? I've just written a paper on that too. Debate is not that we sit here in the media or do it. Debate is really, and I think the best way that I heard it said was Neil deGrasse Tyson, the guy who did Cosmos, said it to Fareed Zakaria on a television show. Fareed Zakaria asked him about climate change. He said, hey, climate change is a settled matter. There is climate change taking place. You will always find one or two kooks who may disagree, because that's what academia is. Some people agree, some disagree. But he said what we have to look at the broad mass of citations. And it's citations that create a debate. And it's citations that are important. In Pakistan, we have no citation culture because we don't do original research. So that's a big problem. And the research that we do is so donor-driven that by definition, there won't be a citation. So this is something we have to work on. There's no, for example, there's not even an economic association in this country. Only one professional association, which is the Pakistan Society for Development Economics. It's very flawed. There's no real, I can go on and on, but that's the answer to the question.
Okay, let's make it interactive. So, Ali, any other points that you want to raise with reference to what Nadeem has said?
Yeah, I think it's working. So I think sort of Nadeem makes this kind of stark distinction between debates leading change or ideas leading change, and there is another view that it's changes in power structures that open up things for ideas to percolate. I think the way I see it is that we have bottlenecks on both sides, right? So in some sense, he's right that if you look at the depth of professional associations, that's not just economists. Take any professional associations. I'll give you kind of a simple example. You take, there's a big scandal around these water projects these days. The real issue with these water projects is procurement and an agreement on solutions. Where would any government look towards solution today? It would look towards international companies to provide those solutions. But actually, there's huge disagreement amongst international community companies, and when they come in, it creates a contentiousness. There is no consensus, even in a majority professional association here, about what those particular solutions are, and that creates huge deadlocks. But I think that paucity of ideas is one constraint. I think the other constraint, which I think Nadeem talks about, but in his paradigm, and this has always been a debate between Nadeem and me because I give much more weight to politics and how do you open up political structures. The fact is that one thing which makes Pakistan a complete outlier from its adjoining companies is the degree of elite control, right, both in politics and in administration. It's just huge. I mean, we're way off the charts when you look at the concentration of political power. And the question is, if you have an elite which is vested in a structure that works for it but not for the wider growth paradigm, then I'm not sure that the only constraint we need to be talking about is ideas. It's a very important constraint, but I think we need to think deeply about how do you change the structure of power, and what are the systemic changes that you can bring about to open up that structure of power. And I think that connects back to your earlier point that you were pushing when you were saying, how do we get from A to B even if we agree with B? I think part of that path would be to say, how do we diffuse power, right? And sort of, so that's the only thing I'd like to push Nadeem on a bit.
Okay. I just want to pull in some people in the audience.
I wanted to make a small
Quickly,
point.
because we left with 15 minutes.
Yeah. So one, I would say, I wouldn't say call it a criticism because maybe that's the harsher word. But this whole idea about ideas coming in from donors and then about elite capture, the book talks about it. How in the 60s and the 70s we had this idea that, we'll do import substitution and we'll do exports. And so there was a lot of effort that was put into this. We had the whole licensing Raj concept and so forth. And obviously that resulted in clusters. We had textiles, for instance, and so forth, which were established. But over a period of time, we have rent seeking coming in and becoming dominant, and a lot of these infant industries like automobiles, etc., are not actually growing up and becoming inefficient over time. So, but then, and the book talks about it. So it looks at 4 or 5, instances of capture. So we have sugar, we have cement, textiles, and so forth. But what I think that what is missing from this thing is that from the 80s onwards, again, this was an imported idea concept, that you start to liberalize and you start, that was the idea, that, you go from one extreme to perhaps the other extreme. And this has happened. And while some of the big sectors, the big clusters, have managed to entrench themselves and continue to seek rents, a lot of your other SMEs and a lot of your other industry has actually gone. So if you look at some of the numbers, for instance, and this is the debate that we have often, and this is State Bank data, that 65% of the inputs of Pakistan's GDP are imported if you exclude services. So now what does this do? Every time you try and grow past 4.5%, you run into a balance of payments crisis. So what is the response to that? You start entrenching. So whether you go into an IMF program and so on and so forth, I think this is one of the reasons why we keep talking about the budget deficit and about reserves and this, that, and the other, because ultimately it's a hard binding constraint. But again, so I think that we shouldn't perhaps, while obviously, rent seeking and the political economy aspects are very, very important to address, but I think that what perhaps we miss here a little bit is that a lot of movement has been made towards the other side. So if you look at all these FTAs that, for instance, we are signing, if you go to the Commerce Ministry, they're constantly thinking about signing FTAs without actually perhaps, going into some of the details of how you structure those FTAs. But anyway, this debate we can...
Okay. Let me just pull in. Puram, you want to come in?
Okay, I'll just make a couple of quick observations. I think of all the discussions that I've attended at this event, I've enjoyed this one the most. Primarily because it touches on a topic that's very close to me as well, and I agree with Nadeem that there should be more economic-oriented sessions in future events. I'm also very, very appreciative of Nadeem's idea that debates and ideas drive the process, even if it's over a very long term. One of the things as an economic journalist that I've noticed over here is that there is not only a severe shortage of supply when it comes to ideas, but a very severe shortage of demand for new ideas as well. Ideas are coming either, in government where a lot of the policy is made. There's no demand and there's no interest in ideas. In the politicians, there's utter disinterest, rhetoric notwithstanding, in any kind of change. In industry, they present vested interests disguised as innovative ideas. And then there's a vast informal sector where debates and conversations play a very marginal role in the articulation of their collective interest. There are a few exceptions, but overall very marginal. I think one of the elements that's been missing in the conversation thus far, but one thing that can serve, and that is currently serving as a very powerful driver of disruptive growth in the economy, is technology. And I think in the years to come, what is happening in mobile banking, what is happening in even ride-hailing services, as mobile phone as they proliferate, and broadband or high-speed internet over mobile phone proliferates, I think from there some kind of a disruptive change can come. But as it stands right now, the system is very, very stable and locked inside what Savail called the hard binding constraints within it. And it's just sort of what's taking place is a sort of a competition for position within the constraints set by that. And that's not a conducive space for ideas and debate. That will result from these CPEC investments. The government has been telling us all about the inflows. Few people then got together and said, well, what about the outflows? But beyond that, there is none. I see three major narratives emerging from CPEC, and all three of them have severe problems. There's the very optimistic narrative put out by the government that this is a game changer and everything is going to be well, and the Chinese are iron brothers and they mean us well. There's the other narrative which is going on the other extreme, saying this is the East India Company coming in, a deeply problematic take, I think, on the whole enterprise. And then there's a more vernacular narrative, which is looking back to scripture and saying, ye Yuj and Majuj ki qaum aa rahi hai, and whatnot. And they are justifying it in the basis of scripture. I don't see a really meaningful debate taking place around where CPEC is taking us for two reasons. Number one, lack of transparency. The government is not giving us enough of a picture of the long-term plan and where CPEC is supposed to be taking us. And number two, because there's this ingrained idea that development and progress is something that you import from outside, that a big brother comes from outside and gives you. It's not something that you grow in your own country with your own effort.
So, I mean, I come from the aid world, and I've learned what you said, Nadeem, which is, I think, the best thing I've heard, which is reform doesn't cost anything. It actually raises money. But what I want to ask you is, having read the book, what is the first step? How does this happen? And once you have that first step, you have whatever type of political will, or you have the ideas, what I've seen is that you need a lot more than political will and ideas. How do you change these massive bureaucracies? I mean, in education, it's like half of the governments. I mean, it's just so enormous, especially in Pakistan. What is the first step, and then how do you actually move the bureaucracies to implement it?
Well, I think I have already written somewhere on the book. And actually, I was reminded of one of our famous short story writers. You read that book?
Which one?
After I wrote the review, or not?
No. Which one is it? I remind you.
Well, this was one of the famous short stories that Pakistanis landed on the moon. And what happened after that? Everybody, I think, has read that story. This is actually an economic counterpart of that same story. But let me come to the main message that Nadeem is pressing. Somebody said here, well, donor-driven ideas and, we did this and we did this. The question is, some other countries also did that and they succeeded. That is our problem. We need to find out what is wrong with us. We always look for somebody else to blame. I mean, even the most serious issue that we have, no, we have no havens here. We have no nothing here. We are all right. We are correct. The other is wrong. And that is our problem.
Okay.
We have to sort of look inward, not in an import substitution sense, but in terms of ideas.
G.
Thank you. That's very interesting analysis, and I look forward to reading your book. But one word that I found missing from the discussion was the citizens. Like, what is the role of citizens in growth? I mean, when you talk about growth and the economic model, it sounds very much like the trickle-down theory of the 80s, and it's just an assumption that if we, grow our cities, urbanization, and governance, all of that will eventually trickle down and benefit citizens. But we also saw with the local government ordinance, the whole idea behind it of strengthening the citizen-state engagement. And I mean, I think, people will have different theories as to how well that's worked or not worked. But does your book at all, or do you at all have any views on how do we, look more at the demand side accountability, and strengthen citizen engagement in this process, so that it's more of a pro-poor growth model, more of an inclusive growth model, and not just an assumption that by fixing the supply side that it'll automatically impact.
Okay. That gentleman there in a tie and pocket square.
Assalamu alaikum. I am Hussain. I am a probationary officer of the Pakistan Administrative Service at the Civil Service Academy. I had the good fortune of reading your book, sir. Two points. Your book puts much of the blame for what ails the governance and economy of Pakistan on the bureaucracy. While I think that for the last 30 years or so, the politicians and the generals who've put on the mask of politicians have been in the driving seat, and the bureaucracy has been co-opted using the carrot and the stick of prize postings. So do you think that fair to put the onus on the bureaucracy for what ails the governance of Pakistan? And secondly, your book points out that academia has a large part to play in the reforms process. While I think that the academia can only point finger at what is wrong. So these two comments, please. I would like to have your comments on these 2 points. Thank you very much.
Okay. Look, I think these are very good comments, and I fully agree with most of the questions that have come up, right? I mean, I think Ali is right. We need to understand power better. Absolutely correct, right? I don't deny that at all. We also need to understand how power works in the system. I think I take a stab at it in the book. I'm not saying it's at all solved, and I can talk about it, we can talk about it. I think what Savail talked about, very important. For example, automobile sugars, etc., that he talked about. Industrial organization is a very important subject. And I submit to you, this is where I come into the conversation. When I look through the literature, I don't find enough papers on industrial organization. I don't find enough papers on power. Right? Ali's worked on it a little bit, but there are very few papers, hardly any. And industrial organization is almost a virgin field, right? We know we tried to do SRO reforms for 20 years, we failed. But again, academia has hardly done any papers on SRO reform, right? Now, if you go on to entrepreneurship, and Savail said about liberalization, etc. Yes, liberalization worked up to a point, Savail. But we just liberalized the trade regime for 2 or 3 years and then backed off from it. Now we've reversed the liberalization with these surcharges. At the same time, we stopped purchasing wheat for a little while and we backed off from that. We stopped subsidizing fertilizer, we backed off from that. So, there has been a turning back from liberalization, right? Now, I think this is absolutely correct. Where is the demand for ideas, as Khurram said? And we have to think about whether there's a demand for ideas or not. Demand for ideas is not a static thing, Khurram. Demand for ideas is supposed to be endogenous in a society. And I agree with you right now, there is no demand for ideas. But a growing society, this is what, even if you read all the major thinkers, why nations fail or whatever, a growing society demands change, demands ideas. And unfortunately, we are not there yet. I can't say we are there. I hope we will get there because that's a precondition, in my mind, to go forward. There has to be some debate or something, right? And as you say, Savail talked about FTAs, for example. Savail, FTAs, for God's sakes, shouldn't be done. It's a disaster. That's what I'm saying. And FTAs were done purely by the bureaucracy. Politicians didn't make us do FTAs. FTAs done by the bureaucracy. They did it because they get good trips overseas. Politicians don't even read the FTAs. They don't even know what's in the FTAs. So that's one example, but there are others too. I think I'm not pointing fingers at the bureaucrats. I'm not pointing fingers at that. Bureaucrats are perfectly fine people. We need a bureaucracy. Yes, they are important. They must be there. They are very well educated. They're all competent. They're very good friends of ours. It's not the fault of the bureaucracy. It's the system. It's a system that forces the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy lost its political independence. Bureaucracy lost its ability to control its own destiny. They can come and pick one or two people from you and kind of strangle the whole system. It's the systemic flaws that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about any one individual. Systemic flaws we have to fix. And Nadia said, where would I begin? I do talk about it in the book, but I don't want to give the cat away. But I think it's a very important discussion to have. For example, what the donor does is, I've been there when I was in office, for example, donors used to come to my table with a big, thick consulting report, which had got 3 or 4 of you to write, right? And I looked at it and I said, where am I going to read it? I don't have the time. I don't even have the people to read it. So I'd pick it up, throw it in the waste paper basket, and they'd get offended. I said, look, you bring me a report on 20 subjects every day. I don't have the time to read them. And who has the time to read these reports? If we begin with a diffuse palette, like they came to me and said, this is a sanitation report. I don't even want to do sanitation yet, right? This is a water report, okay? If we are dealing with 20,000 subjects at one time, when we don't have the capacity to deal even with one, we don't know where to begin. But then again, I come back. It's the failure of academia. They're not throwing up ideas on the table. What I call the linchpin reform, where to begin. It's yours and my fault that we haven't developed it. You just mentioned education bureaucracy. But think about it. There are 20,000 papers running regressions on education, demand for education, returns to education, etc. How many papers do you see on education bureaucracy? I would venture to say none. Right? This is the failure that I'm talking about, academic failure, because we are led by the data, which is the lamp. We go to the lamp, we don't worry about the system. Education bureaucracy is in front of our eyes too, but I don't have hard data on it, so I can't talk about it. But I can run regressions, which looks very smart, so I'll run regressions. Whereas the education bureaucracy is right there, I can see it right in front of me, in my neighborhood. How do we begin to talk about that? How do we begin to have that conversation? I think that's the issue. So each of these areas that you pointed out are very good, but I'm pointing back. Where is the research on that? Why are we not holding sessions on these subjects, which are so important to this country? I would like to see a session on the bureaucracy. I would like to see a session on the politics, for example. These are important subjects that should be subject of our research. Don't you think they're more important than Mr. and Mrs. Jinnah?
Excuse me?
Very quickly, because I think we've run out of time, or we're about to run out.
Okay, the debate started with a dismal news that I'm not going to be getting my free copy of this book, but it started getting better as time passed. Okay, but just a quick point कि मुझे ये लगता है कि ये आपकी बात बिल्कुल सही है. मैं पहले पूरी खैर बुक देखूंगा और इसमें चीज़ें हैं, बट मेरे ख्याल में जो सोसाइटी है या स्टेट है उसमें सब्जेक्ट जो है ये नहीं पॉसिबल कि सिर्फ इकोनॉमी के आइडियाज़ ग्रो करें, पॉलिटिकल आइडियाज़ पीछे रह जाएं. ये भी नहीं पॉसिबल कि पॉलिटिकल आइडियाज़ आगे जा रहे हों और इकोनॉमी के आइडियाज़ पीछे रह जाएं. सो इन अ स्टेट हम ऊपर भी इकट्ठे ही जाते हैं और नीचे भी इकट्ठे ही जाते हैं. सो द आइडियाज़ की जो बात, फॉर एग्जांपल इट हैज़ different ideas of different dimensions. For example, CPAC is a very economic idea, but at the same time it's a very political idea. So आप security के ऊपर आपके ideas क्या होंगे, economy के ऊपर ideas क्या होंगे और पॉलिटिक्स के ऊपर आइडियाज़ क्या होंगे और फिर गवर्नेंस के ऊपर आइडियाज़ क्या होंगे. सो द स्टेट्स सिंक एंड स्विम टुगेदर. इस तरह पूरे जो डिफरेंट ऑर्गन्स हैं, तो मुझे लगता यही है कि इकोनॉमी के ऊपर ये some of the ideas that you guys have discussed are really important, but of course we need political ideas that Cheema sahab has said and some other ideas which Savail has said.
So I would like to get your comments on the ideological part that we are facing. Similarly, what he highlighted, because I think media and academia both stress way too much on a very moralistically, which they approve of, moralistically correct idea of socialism, where you end up with a more government control. And I would like to comment what Mr. Fawad Chaudhry said. I think it is less government control, which may lead to some sort of economic prosperity here, because yes, दोनों चीज़ें ऊपर भी साथ जाती हैं और नीचे भी साथ ही आ रही हैं, और हम लोगों को I guess सही तरह से बताया नहीं जा रहा, and there's a huge disconnect between the people that we are trying to reach and people who can actually take some action. And the more government control that we would invest in, exactly like public education, we as a government and as social activists, we also stress on public education. Government doesn't earn money. It's the people who earn money and who pay taxes. So when we stress on more investment in public education, that is what we mean is spend more. That will actually cause more taxation to be applied on everybody. Whereas we do not question on the outcome of public education. So this is just one example.
One more question if anyone has one. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. So my question, there is a gap between students and the research centers. You know, we need in this country native potential, who can solve the problem of native problems. And there is a lackness between, there is no chance for students, especially for the young minds, and no opportunities for them. So how can we solve this problem? There is a lack of artificial intelligence, especially in this modern time. We need for the reform, for betterness in this country, artificial intelligence. Thanks so much.
Gee, thank you. देखिए, a couple of things. Politics I'm not ignoring at all, Fawad. I think politics is a part of the thing, and I talk about it in the book. The big solution in the book is, for example, what has happened is that thanks to this external influence and the love for money, we have forgotten about the civil service and the bureaucracy and the government. The Patwari is still where he is, and we are trying to build BISP, and we are trying to build so many foundations, etc. You guys are doing in the frontier. Punjab has 17 companies, and we've forgotten about the bureaucracy. We are trying to do waste management via Turkey, but we're not building up a bureaucracy. So the big thing is we must fix a state. But a state is both bureaucracy as well as politics. And the problem is politics. So I would argue that, for example, I argue in the book very strongly that our constitution is deeply flawed because we never discussed a constitution. It was a copy of the Government of India Act. There is not enough checks and balances. The electoral system is bad. There are all kinds of problems with the constitution which are discussed there. And I think we need a deep constitutional reform. If only the politicians could do it, but the politicians unfortunately can't even pass a law, as the Chief Justice says. So we've got a problem. But academia has not even defined the reform yet. We haven't, for example, we haven't even, 5 years Imran Khan has been raising the issue of elections. Have we seen a good paper on electoral reform? We still have the first past the post system, which is now shown to be deeply flawed. We don't even have a simple thing like an, I'm not going to vote section in the bill, in the vote. We don't have transferable, all kinds of systems I can think of, but nobody's done that research. Nobody talks about it. Exactly. So I mean, we have all these things. So I think this is a subject. All I'm saying is it's an important subject. I can point to a number of things that can be done, but look, I'm also conscious enough that my solutions are not the only solutions. But my questions are more important than my solutions. And we must discuss these issues, right? And unfortunately, we haven't done that, right? Now, the second thing is that I want to talk about is also trickle down that the lady raised there. And that's related to the question that was raised there. Look, I'm not advocating either free market or government control. I think that debate is passé. The free market with government debate is gone. After 2008 crisis, we know we need the government, we know we need the market. The question is, we need first-class government, first-class market. As I keep saying, development is like a baby. It requires two parents, the government and the market. But if one parent is bad, no development can happen. Both parents have to be good. And the whole book is about how to make better parents, how to make a better market, better government. And the location obviously has to be cities. So we have to talk about all that. Then the last point was, let me see, what was it? Oh God, I've lost my paper. Time is up, yeah, okay, fine. Okay, so that's, I think, that's it. Basically the point is, ladies and gentlemen, we must read, we must debate, we must think up fresh ideas, we must be bold in our thinking. The student. Look, I'll tell you how the students can. Students have to wake up and be bold. Your professors are making you, sorry, what is the word I'm looking for? Your professors are to blame, not you. They're holding you back. They're using yesterday's notes, they're teaching you yesterday's stuff. They're asking you to do theses that are going nowhere. Be bold in your questions. Think, read, understand. Today you're lucky. You have the internet, you can read any paper in the world. When I was growing up, Anjum was with me, he'll tell you, PT was there too. We couldn't even find papers because they were all in paper form and we had to go overseas to learn. So there's a lot you can do, but you have to be bold. You have to look for mentors. Your professors, unfortunately, will fail you. Sorry.
I'm sure you've enjoyed the session. बाकी जहाँ तक ताल्लुक़ है जिस कॉन्वर्सेशन की आप बात कर रहे हैं, जिसके लिए क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग चाहिए, जिसका आपने जिक्र किया, वरना फिर वही बात होगी, कतरे में दजला दिखाई ना दे जुज़ में कुल, खेल लड़कों का हुआ दीदा पीना ना हुआ. On that note, thank you.